So welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at, or starting to look at, the certain wisdom aspects of the Buddha's teaching, so stretching over the next 3 or 4 weeks. And the topic for today is conditionality and the 5 Niyamas. So conditionality, or Paticcasamuppada as it is in Pali, is a fundamental expression of the Buddha's enlightenment experience. When the Buddha became enlightened and he realized that he wanted to and needed to teach what he had experienced, to communicate it to others, the first teaching that he gave, which was to his former 5 companions from his period of asceticism, the teaching that he gave to them was based on this idea of conditionality, of Paticcasamuppada. So it forms a fundamental basis of the Dharma that followed. It's, we could say, the yardstick against which all claims of a teaching to be Dharma can be measured. That if a teaching doesn't agree with the principles of Paticcasamuppada, then it's not true Dharma. So Paticcasamuppada is often translated as conditioned co-production or dependent co-arising, sometimes dependent origination. They're all rather clunky phrases for translating the Pali term. Less than satisfactory, as often is the case of translating from Pali into English. 1 word or even 2 or 3 words often don't do justice. But we quite often, because of their clunkiness, we often reduce it to this term conditionality, which we use as a kind of shorthand. It's convenient perhaps to have 1 word, but there is a risk associated with just thinking of Paticcasamuppada as conditionality. There's a risk of misunderstanding the full implications of the original in using this term, and hopefully that risk will come out in what I have to say later. But for now, because it's convenient, I'll continue to use conditionality, perhaps with just that little warning to be careful about our usage of it. So Paticcasamuppada speaks of the Buddha's realization that all things arise in dependence on conditions and change or pass away when those conditions change or cease. In a sutra in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Buddha summarizes the principle of Paticcasamuppada in this very well-known verse. The verse is, "This being, that becomes. From the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that does not become. From the ceasing of this, that ceases." So this is really probably the shortest expression of Paticcasamuppada that we could find. This principle that things arise from something else and cease when that thing from which they arose ceases. And this principle applies to everything in our experience, to the material world around us in all its many and varied forms, from the unimaginably small subatomic particle to the unimaginably large galaxy. This principle of Paticcasamuppada holds true. From the germination of an acorn to the fullness of the mighty oak tree, it all depends upon conditions. And in later teachings, the Buddha expanded on this idea a bit, and Sangharakshita has also expanded on the Buddha's later explanations of Paticcasamuppada to include the various ways in which conditionality can work, the various levels on which conditionality works, to try and get some idea of the depth and complexity. And we have this teaching of the 5 Niyamas, the 5 spheres of conditionality, the 5 areas in which conditionality operates, if you like. So we can see conditionality working in these particular areas. Now, the language is modern. The language is Sangharakshita's language, but it's based on the original teachings of the Buddha as developed throughout the Buddhist tradition. So we have the first 3 levels, which are processes that, if you like, underpin life, underpin the way things are. We have the physical organic processes, and again, the technical term for that is the Utu Niyama. So these are the processes which we would recognize under the laws of physics, you know, the laws of motion, laws of thermodynamics, laws of quantum mechanics, and so on and so forth, gravity, all of those sort of things, physical organic processes, processes that influence our lives, but over which we have no control. We can't change the laws of physics. They are what they are. If we step off the edge of a cliff, we're going to fall down. We're never going to go up, unless we strap a rocket pack to our back or something. So the natural laws as they apply in the physical world. Moving on from that, there are also the physical organic processes, what we might call biology, botany, the laws that govern things that live or are alive in the natural world. There are the principles underlying mental processes, the non-volitional mental processes, what we might call our instinctive mental processes, or the mental processes that go on subconsciously that control the body and that have an effect on our conscious mind, but it's largely an unseen effect, and it's certainly not one of our own volition. It's an effect that we are subject to, just as we are subject to the laws of physics, the laws of gravity, and so on and so forth. They're processes which we can't directly change or alter. So when the body requires food, there's a feeling of hunger. There's a drive to procreate, which is built in, if you like, into our mental processes. We can do things to mitigate against some of the effects of some of these processes, but we can't actually stop the processes themselves. Then we come on to the sphere of volitional actions, the Karma Niyama. I'm not going to say too much about that because that's the topic for next week's talk. So you'll have to come back next week for more on karma. But it's that area of activity where we do have control, where we make decisions, where we do this or we do that. We don't do this or we don't do that. And then beyond that is this level, the Dharma Niyama, which we could say is the area in which spiritual processes work. That having done whatever we can do in the Karma Niyama to set up conditions for our practice, it's then in the Dharma Niyama that the spiritual processes take over, as it were. It's those processes that lead inexorably to enlightenment once we've gone beyond a certain stage, once we've reached the point of irreversibility, of which more will come probably in following weeks. But it's those processes, again, we don't have control over those processes, but we experience those processes in our lives. So these are the 5 areas on which conditionality works. And it's important to bear these in mind because as I'll say next week on the Karma Niyama, there's a lot more at play than simply what we choose to do or not do. Paticca Samuppada is a lot more complex than we might initially think. So the processes, as I've said, of conditionality apply to everything in the world around us, the material world, the natural world, everything that we see. But far more importantly, perhaps, is that they apply on the internal level as well, on what's going on within us. Our physical bodies are totally dependent upon external and internal conditions. Without food and water, the body couldn't exist. Without clothing and shelter, we would not survive through the winter. Without a source of income, we couldn't function in the society in which we live. Without a mother and father, we wouldn't be here in the first place to be concerned with any of this. And so it goes on. Everything that we do, everything that we are, is dependent upon conditions. And this applies to our state of mind also. Our state of mind arises on the basis of conditions. So if someone's nice to us, if they speak or act in a kindly way towards us, we feel in a good mood. We feel valued, we feel heard, we feel that our circumstances are good, we're positive. A state of mind dependent upon those conditions. On the other hand, if someone's rude or aggressive towards us, then we may start to feel anxious, we may start to feel afraid, we may become angry and aggressive in return. And again, a state of mind that's arisen based upon conditions, based upon what's happening around us, what's happening to us. So wherever we look, we can see conditionality at work. It's clearly obvious, really, to anyone who's got eyes to see. And you don't need me to tell you that conditionality is a factor in our lives. So if it's so obvious, if it's so self-evident that we all know it, then why did the Buddha make such a big thing of it? Why did it form the main theme of his first teaching, of his first steps into communicating his enlightenment experience? It must have been as perfectly obvious to the people of his day as it is to us. Well, I think we can find the answer to this in some of the suttas, some of the records of the Buddha's teaching, some of those early records preserved in the Pali canon of the suttas. So this deceptively simple verse that I quoted earlier, this being that becomes, which we'll have up on the screen now. There we go. So that's the verse I quoted earlier, this being that becomes, and so on. You can see it's a very simple verse, just a few lines. Its simplicity, though, hides a deeply profound teaching in there. And I referred earlier to the risk in using a term as simple as conditionality, because that too can hide the depth of the teaching of Paticca Samutpada, because we can take it at a very superficial level, just as we could take this verse at a very superficial level. And we could simply take it to mean that everything arises on the basis of a cause and an effect. As simple as that. It is just cause and effect. Here is the cause, there's the effect. And there's a delightful, well, yeah, I think it's quite delightful little account from the Pali canon concerning the Buddha's attendant Ananda. I feel quite sorry for Ananda. It just seems so often he walks straight into it. Wherever there's a bear trap waiting to be walked into, Ananda will walk into it with his eyes wide open, never sees it coming. And it's a bit like this in this account. So Ananda was with the Buddha for over 25 years, I think, and he was the Buddha's attendant right up until the time the Buddha passed away. Ananda didn't gain enlightenment until after the Buddha had passed away. So here, when this incident took place, Ananda was the Buddha's faithful attendant, hearing all of the Buddha's teachings, remembering all of the Buddha's teachings. We owe Ananda a great debt, because it said that it was Ananda that remembered and recounted all of the Buddha's teachings, and that formed the basis of the Dharma that's been handed down, eventually reaching us. So yeah, Ananda seemed to make a lot of mistakes, but nonetheless, he did us a great service in the work that he did, and he did become enlightened after the Buddha passed away. So here we are, Ananda commenting on Paticca Samutpada, conditioned co-production. Wonderful Lord, marvelous Lord, is the depth of this causal law, and how deep it appears. And yet I reckon it as ever so plain. And you can almost imagine Ananda sort of, yeah, I've got this, I know this, and he's expecting the Buddha to give him some affirmation, you know, oh, well done, Ananda, yeah, you've really understood that, that's good, great. But no, that wasn't the reply that Ananda got. And again, I can imagine a kind of deflated look on his face as he heard the Buddha's reply. Say not so, Ananda, say not so. Deep indeed is this causal law, and deep it appears. Hard to perceive, hard to understand, calm, sublime, beyond logic, subtle, intelligible only to the wise. So I think poor old Ananda had made the mistake of thinking of Paticca Samutpada in terms of simply cause and effect, something that he could see all around him every day. You know, you plant a seed in the ground and up pops a flower. You put food in the cooking pot and 20 minutes later go back and you've got nicely cooked rice. So on, cause and effect. You do something and it has an effect. And of course, this is perfectly true. This is how we see things happening. And this may well be how we see conditionality, particularly when we use that shorthand term of conditionality. The temptation is there just to see it as simply cause and effect. So if we think that we've understood Paticca Samutpada or conditionality, then we, just like Ananda, have probably got it wrong, or at least we've only got part of the picture. Because the Buddha described it as beyond logic and intelligible only to the wise. So unless we think that we're able to go beyond logic and we class ourselves amongst the wise, then we probably haven't got the full picture of Paticca Samutpada. Just a little word about who the wise are, just so that we understand perhaps what we're talking about here. We're not talking about people who have some higher level of intelligence. We're not talking about people who've got a first-class honours degree or people who've got a Mensa IQ. In Buddhist terms, the term wise refers to people who have seen with some degree of transcendental insight the true nature of reality. They've seen how things really are. So that's the wise who can understand or can find intelligible the full depth of Paticca Samutpada, of conditioned co-production. So it's not simply a kind of linear causality that we might assume it to be, because we can easily understand that. And that's not beyond our reasoning minds. It's not beyond our logic to understand simple cause and effect. We work with it all the time. So how might it be different from this, or how might it be more than this? So let's take a simple example. If we're feeling depressed, we may well ask our doctor for a pill to change the chemistry of our brain, to give us a lift, to make our mood feel more positive. We're looking for something from the material world to have an effect on our inner world, on our consciousness. And we're used to thinking along those lines that the material world, the world out there, comes before the world of our consciousness, the world in here. We're used to thinking that it's the material world that causes and influences our consciousness and our mental states. But we're probably less used to thinking of things happening the other way round, that it's our inner world of thoughts and feelings that condition the outer world, the world that we perceive of as out there. In the Buddha's vision of Paticca Samutpada, the inner world and the outer world are not two different things. They're inseparably interrelated. And that interrelationship works both ways. It's not a one-way relationship. So it's not just simply linear causality. It works both ways. It's a mutual feedback system, if you like. And the Buddha's teaching makes it clear that within Paticca Samutpada, conditioned co-production, There's no question of the material world coming before consciousness and causing it, nor vice versa. The material world and consciousness arise together. They arise simultaneously, and they depend upon each other. Now, this is quite a difficult idea to get our heads around, things arising simultaneously, this mutual dependence on each other, this mutual conditioning, which is why, in some ways, the translation for Paticca Samuppada of conditioned co-production or dependent co-arising gives a slightly fuller picture than simply reducing it to conditionality. It was difficult to understand in the Buddha's time. Not all of his followers were able to grasp it. And again, in the Pali Canon, there's an occasion where a particular monk, Kotita, was unable to grasp the implications of this. So he turned to Shariputra, one of the Buddha's wisest disciples. Shariputra was renowned for his wisdom, and he often expanded on the Buddha's teaching for the other followers. So Shariputra was in conversation with Kotita, and he expanded on this teaching of the Buddha in this way. He gave a little analogy, which our next slide will show us. So he said, "Very well then, Kotita, my friend, I will give you an analogy. It is as if two sheaves of reeds were to stand leaning against one another. In the same way, from name and form as a requisite condition comes consciousness. From consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form. If one were to pull away one of those sheaves of reeds, the other would fall. If one were to pull away the other, the first one would fall." So we have this very descriptive little analogy using the natural world, which anyone in the Buddha's time would have seen, sheaves of corn standing in a field, just as we see in this photograph here in more modern times, and one representing the physical body, the material world, one representing consciousness. And the two stand in relation to each other. If you take either one of them away, the other one falls down. Doesn't matter which one you take away, the other one will fall down, because they depend upon, they stand on the condition of the other being there. And it's the same with us. It's the same. This is our experience, that you can't have the material world without consciousness. You can't have consciousness without the material world. They depend upon each other. And I think this little analogy beautifully illustrates the Buddha's vision of Paticca Samuppada not being limited to our ideas of how things happen simply as cause and effect. It includes that's part of it, but it goes far beyond it as well. It speaks of a world of constantly changing mental and physical processes that interact with each other and mutually condition each other in a way that is beyond full comprehension by the enlightened mind. So I hope that's given you some feeling for the depth of this teaching of conditionality. We can begin to understand it on a fairly superficial level. Full understanding of it arises from our experience of insight into the nature of reality. So wherever we are in grasping conditionality, conditioned co-production, we've probably still got a fair way to go before we can say we truly get this teaching. Thank you.